The heat was a living thing. It pressed down on the roof of the iron horse, baked the dust on the windows, and shimmered above the endless expanse of the New Mexico territory. Inside the last car of the westbound train, the air was thick with the grit of the desert and the sweat of men who had long given up on the notion of comfort. The world outside was a canvas of scorched ochre and pale, unforgiving blue, a place where life clung precariously to the edges of existence, much like the girl who now stood trembling between the cars. She had been moving backward, always backward, since she'd slipped away from the water stop in adobe walls. Each car she passed through was a new circle of hell. The first held families, their loud, boisterous life a painful reminder of everything she had lost and would never have. The next was filled with prospectors and gamblers, their eyes greedy and sharp, lingering on her for a moment too long before dismissing her as having nothing they could take. Then came the car full of soldiers, their uniforms crisp but their gazes coarse, and she had hurried past, her head bowed, feeling their whispers on her skin like crawling insects. Now, there was only this last car, a place of freight and finality. It was mostly empty, save for a few crates tied down with thick rope and, in the far corner, a man. He was a silhouette against the glaring afternoon sun that poured through the grimy window, tall and broad. He sat not with the slump of a weary traveler, but with the stillness of a mountain. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the hard line of his jaw and the way his hands rested on his knees, not relaxed, but simply at ease. He wore a long, heavy duster coat, the color of the dust outside. Despite the suffocating heat, it seemed an absurd choice of clothing, a personal declaration of indifference to the elements that were slowly cooking everyone else alive. He hadn't moved a muscle since she'd entered, his gaze fixed on the passing desolation. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the stoic mesas and the skeletal remains of sun-bleached cattle they occasionally passed. He was a creature of this hard land, forged in its silence and its heat. Fear was a cold stone in the girl's stomach, a stark contrast to the fire in her lungs. She could still hear their voices in her mind, not the shouts of pursuit, but the casual, cruel conversation she had overheard from behind the saloon door. The words had sealed her fate, bartering her away like a head of cattle for a poker debt and a half-dozen bottles of whiskey. Mr. Gable, the man who owned the saloon and, until this morning, had owned her indenture, had a laugh like rocks grinding together. He had looked at her with an owner's eyes, his intentions a suffocating blanket she had been choking under for months. Fleeing wasn't a choice, it was an instinct, the last desperate act of a cornered animal. She pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the car, trying to make herself small, invisible. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was a frantic heartbeat. Click-clack, click-clack, you must run! Click-clack, click-clack, he will find you! The train was her only hope, a serpent of smoke and steel tearing through the wilderness. But she knew it wasn't enough. They would be on this train, Gable's men. She had seen them at the station, their faces grim, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. They were hunters, and she was the quarry. It was only a matter of time before they worked their way to this final car. Her eyes darted back to the man in the corner. He was her only unknown. Every other soul on this train was a predictable danger, a variable she could calculate. But him, he was a void. He could be a lawman. He could be an outlaw. He could be a farmer, a rancher, a man running from something himself. He could be worse than the men she was fleeing. Or he could be nothing, a man who would simply watch as they dragged her away, his face as impassive as the desert. Her breath hitched in her throat. She heard a door slam shut in the next car, followed by the heavy tread of boots. It was them. She knew it with a certainty that was colder than her fear. Panic seized her, a wild, frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. There was nowhere to hide. The crates were too low. The space beneath the seats was too small. There was only the open, unforgiving space of the train car and the silent man in the corner. An idea, born of pure desperation, flickered in her mind. It was insane. It was a plea to a stranger, a man who had shown no sign of kindness, no hint of compassion. It was asking the mountain to move, the desert to grant mercy. But the footsteps were getting closer, more distinct over the train's relentless rhythm. Her choice had been reduced to one: the certainty of capture or the slimmest chance of deliverance. She pushed herself off the wall, her legs unsteady, moving as if through water. Each step was an eternity. The floorboards creaked beneath her worn-out shoes. The man did not stir, yet she felt his awareness of her, a subtle shift in the air. He wasn't just looking out the window anymore. He was listening. He was waiting. She stopped a few feet from him, her shadow falling across his dusty boots. She could see him more clearly now. His face, still mostly in shadow, was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind and hardship. He wasn't old, perhaps 30 or so, but his eyes, when he finally turned them toward her, seemed ancient. They were the color of a stormy sky, gray and deep, and they held no surprise, no pity, no curiosity. They simply were. They saw her, a girl of no more than 17, with terror in her wide blue eyes, her calico dress torn at the hem and smudged with dirt, her blonde hair escaping its bun in panicked strands. They saw all of this, and they revealed nothing. Her own voice was a ghost in her throat. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. The footsteps were just outside the door now, accompanied by a low, gravelly voice. They were here. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and immediate. They were not tears of sadness, but of pure, undiluted terror. She clasped her hands together, a prayerful gesture she hadn't made in years. Her words, when they finally came, were a bare whisper, a breath of sound almost lost in the noise of the train. "Please, sir," she breathed, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperation. "Please, hide me." The man, Silas, looked at her. His expression did not change. He did not ask her name. He did not ask who she was hiding from or why. He did not offer words of comfort or gestures of reassurance. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, for a full 3 seconds. To the girl, it was a lifetime. In that silence, she saw her future laid bare: the rough hands, Gable's leering smile, the end of everything. Then, slowly, deliberately, he moved. It was not a sudden act of charity, but a movement as steady and inevitable as the turning of the earth. He lifted the edge of his heavy duster coat. The gesture was small, simple, yet it was the most profound act of grace she had ever witnessed. It was an invitation, an offering of sanctuary in a world that had offered her none. He created a space of darkness and shadow beneath the thick wool, a small cave of safety in the roaring, sun-drenched belly of the beast. He did not look at her as she scrambled forward on her knees. He simply returned his gaze to the window, to the blur of sand and scrub brush, as if he were merely adjusting his coat against a chill that did not exist. She huddled into the space he had made, curling herself into a tight ball at his side, her cheek pressed against the rough denim of his trousers. The coat fell over her like a shroud, plunging her into a world of muffled sound and near total darkness. The air was close, smelling of dust, leather, and the faint, clean scent of the man himself. It was the smell of the earth, of horses and open spaces. She could feel the solid strength of his leg against her shoulder, an anchor in her storm of fear. Through the thick fabric of his coat and the floorboards of the train, she could feel the steady, rhythmic vibration of the wheels. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound was no longer a taunt, but a lullaby, a promise of distance. The door to the car scraped open. Heavy boots thumped onto the wooden floor. "Just the one fella in here," a gruff voice said, laced with impatience. "You there," another voice barked. "Sharper and colder. You see a girl come through here, young, blonde. in a blue dress, looked scared as a rabbit. The girl held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she was sure they must hear it. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a god she no longer believed in. She felt the man beside her shift ever so slightly, a minute adjustment of his weight. It was the only sign that he was even aware of the other men's presence. The silence that followed was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was a vast, empty canyon of time, and she was falling through it. She braced herself for the coat to be ripped away, for the harsh light to flood in, for the rough hands to seize her. Then she heard his voice. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was low and steady, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very ground beneath them. It was a voice that held no excitement, no deception, just a simple statement of fact. "Been nobody through here but the conductor," he said, and that was an hour back. There was another pause. The girl could hear the soft creak of leather as one of the men shifted his weight. She imagined their suspicious eyes scanning the half-empty car, lingering on the lone passenger in his absurdly heavy coat. "Just freightin' this one," the first voice grumbled. "Let's check the roof, come on." The footsteps retreated. The door slammed shut, and the sounds of their presence were swallowed once more by the noise of the train. For a long time, neither of them moved. The girl remained curled in her cocoon of darkness, her entire body trembling with the aftermath of terror. She listened to the steady, even rhythm of the man's breathing, a slow, deep metronome that gradually calmed the frantic beating of her own heart. He had not questioned, he had not judged, he had not hesitated. In a world that had only ever sought to use her, to barter her, to break her, this stranger, this mountain of a man, had simply sheltered her. He had offered up the shadow of his coat, and in doing so, had given her back a sliver of hope. The train rattled on, carrying them deeper into the vast, indifferent heart of the West, and beneath the coat of a silent man, a girl who had forgotten what it felt like to be safe finally stopped running. Time stretched and thinned under the oppressive weight of the duster coat. An hour passed, maybe two. The relentless afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, its light shifting from a white-hot glare to a molten gold that bled across the desert floor. Long, skeletal shadows grew from every rock and cactus. Ellie remained in her dark, cramped sanctuary, her body aching from being curled so tightly, her senses on a razor's edge. The initial wave of relief had receded, leaving behind a residue of simmering anxiety. They had gone, but for how long men like them, men like Gable, did not give up easily. Their pride was as much a part of the hunt as any bounty. She listened to the man's breathing, the slow, deep cadence, a strange comfort in the suffocating silence between them. He had not moved, had not spoken a word since he'd lied for her. He was a statue carved from granite and patience. She wondered what he was thinking, staring out at that endless, empty land. Was he regretting his decision? Was he weighing the trouble she had brought to his door? She could feel the vibrations of the train through his body, a constant, jarring rhythm that had become the new beat of her life. Then, a change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a stiffening in the muscles of his leg, a slight shift in his posture. He had sensed something. Ellie's own body went rigid. She strained her ears, trying to hear past the clatter of the wheels and the groaning of the car. And then she heard it. The same heavy tread of boots, but faster this time, more purposeful, angrier. They were coming back. The door at the far end of the car crashed open, slamming against its frame. It wasn't the tentative scrape of before. It was a kick, an act of violent frustration. "He ain't on the roof." "Thorne," the same gruff voice from before complained, laced with the whine of a man tired of being led on a fool's errand. "And he ain't in any of the other cars. We've turned him inside out." "She's on this train," a second voice, the cold, sharp one she now knew as Thorne, snapped back. "Gable said she got on here. A scared rabbit don't just vanish into thin air. We missed something." Ellie felt a tremor of pure ice slide down her spine. They were going to search again, properly this time, They would tear the car apart, look under every crate, and they would certainly not ignore the lone passenger in the corner. Before the thought could fully form, before the panic could reclaim her, the man beside her moved. His action was not born of panic but of cold, clear certainty. One hand, large and calloused, shot out from under his coat and clamped around her arm. It was not a painful grip, but it was absolute, leaving no room for argument or hesitation. With his other hand, he pushed the heavy duster aside, and the dying light of the afternoon flooded her vision, blinding her for a moment. "They're coming back! Jed!" Thorne's voice cut through the noise. "Check this fella again. Get him on his feet. Look under him." Silas was already moving. He didn't look at Ellie. His gaze was fixed on the open doorway on the opposite side of the train car, a gaping mouth that looked out onto a blur of sand, rock, and thorny brush. He rose in a single fluid motion, pulling her up with him, her legs, stiff and numb, nearly buckled, but his grip held her fast. He was a force of nature, pulling her into its current. "Hey, you." The shout came from behind them, but it was already too late. Silas took 2 long strides toward the open door, dragging Ellie with him. For a horrifying, lucid second, she understood what he was about to do. Her mind screamed in protest. The ground was a rushing, indistinct ribbon of brown and green. The train was moving fast, a charging beast of iron and steam. To jump was suicide. She had no time to voice her fear. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her tight against his side. He didn't pause at the edge. He didn't hesitate. He simply launched them out into the void. The world dissolved into a violent, chaotic roar. Wind ripped the breath from her lungs and tore at her hair. For a moment, they were airborne, suspended between the roaring train and the unforgiving earth. Then they hit. The impact was a brutal, full-body shock that drove the air from her in a silent gasp. They didn't land. They crashed. They rolled. A tangle of limbs and flying fabric, down a shallow, gravelly embankment. Thorns from sagebrush and mesquite tore at her dress and her skin, leaving fiery trails of pain. Her head struck something hard, and the world exploded in a flash of white stars. They tumbled over and over, the world a spinning, sickening blur of sky and dirt, sky and dirt. They came to a stop in a cloud of red dust at the bottom of the embankment, wedged against a cluster of sharp-edged rocks. For a moment, there was only pain and the ringing in her ears. The sound of the train was already fading, its click-clack rhythm a departing memory. She was lying half on top of Silas, his body having taken the brunt of the final impact. She pushed herself up, her arms shaking, her body a symphony of new and vibrant aches. A trickle of warmth ran down her temple. Silas was already untangling himself, moving with a grim purpose that defied the violence of their fall. He sat up, his hat gone, revealing a shock of dark brown hair matted with dust. He ignored his own scrapes, his gaze sweeping their surroundings, then pinning on the train tracks. Further down the line, maybe a quarter of a mile, the train was screeching to a halt, a long, agonizing shriek of metal on metal. Black smoke billowed from its stack as it fought its own momentum. "Get up," he said. It was the same low, steady voice, but now it was edged with an urgency that was more terrifying than any shout. He was on his feet, pulling her up again. She stumbled, her ankle twisting, and a sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. He didn't slow, simply adjusted his grip, half carrying her as he began to run. Away from the tracks, toward a series of jagged rock formations that clawed at the skyline. Black figures were dropping from the slowed train, small and distant, but unmistakable. 3 of them. They started moving back along the tracks, their shapes wavering in the heat rising from the desert floor. They had seen them. The hunt was on again. Their flight was a desperate, gasping affair. The terrain was treacherous, a minefield of loose rocks, thorny bushes, and hidden divots that threatened to snap an ankle with every step. Ellie's lungs burned. and a sharp stitch flared in her side. Every part of her that had hit the ground screamed in protest. But the man, Silas, was relentless. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride, his knowledge of the terrain seemingly instinctual. He navigated the hazards without hesitation, his grip on her arm the only thing that kept her from falling. He didn't look back, not once. His focus was entirely forward, on the sanctuary of the rocks ahead. It was a cold, pragmatic focus that left no room for fear or doubt. That certainty flowed through his grip into her, a strange and powerful antidote to her own terror. She stopped thinking and simply ran, her feet following his lead, her survival now entirely in his hands. They reached the base of the rock formations, a jumble of massive, weathered red stones that offered a maze of shadows and potential hiding places. Silas pulled her into the mouth of a narrow ravine, the rock walls rising steeply on either side, instantly swallowing the last of the direct sunlight. The air in here was cooler, smelling of stone and dust and ancient stillness. He finally let go of her arm, and she leaned against the rock wall, gasping for breath, her chest heaving. Silas, barely winded, immediately knelt. He pulled a small leather pouch from inside his duster. From it, he took a piece of flint, a steel striker, and a small, tightly packed bundle of what looked like dried leaves and sage. He worked with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. Within seconds, a spark caught in the tinder. He gently blew on it, coaxing a tiny flame to life. He didn't build a fire for warmth or comfort. He pushed the smoldering bundle into a thick clump of creosote bush at the entrance of the ravine. The oily leaves caught immediately, producing not a clean flame but a thick, acrid plume of greasy black smoke. The smoke billowed out of the ravine's mouth, carried by the evening breeze back in the direction of the tracks, creating a dense, opaque screen. "It'll hide our tracks," he said, answering the unasked question in her eyes, "and make them think we went that way." He gestured with his chin to the south, away from their actual position. He then stamped out the small fire, grinding the embers into the sand with his boot heel until nothing remained. The smoke screen was their only trace. Without another word, he started moving again, deeper into the winding canyon. The pace was slower now, more careful. The ground was uneven, and the growing darkness made every step a hazard. The distant shouts of their pursuers reached them, muffled by the rock. "They're headed for the smoke," it was Jed's voice, full of stupid triumph. "Come on, we got the little rabbit now." Silas paused for a fraction of a second, listening, before continuing his methodical trek into the labyrinth of stone. They twisted and turned through passages so narrow they had to move sideways, their shoulders brushing against the cool, rough rock. The silence here was profound, broken only by the scuff of their boots and their own ragged breathing. In this oppressive silence, with no train to drown out her thoughts, Ellie's mind raced. Who was this man? He was no simple farmer. He moved with the quiet confidence of a predator. Yet he used his skills to protect her. He thought like a hunter, setting a false trail, using the land to his advantage. He had thrown himself from a moving train without a second thought, not just for his own safety, but for hers. He hadn't asked for a single thing in return. He hadn't even asked her name. They finally stopped in a small, circular clearing, almost a cave, with one narrow entrance. A massive boulder leaned overhead, creating a natural roof that hid them from view from above. It was a perfect, defensible hiding spot. Silas leaned against the far wall, finally allowing his own body a moment of rest. In the deep twilight, his face was all angles and shadows, impossible to read. Ellie slid down the rock wall opposite him, her legs giving out completely. Every muscle in her body screamed. Her dress was torn. Her skin was a mess of cuts and bruises, and her ankle throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. But she was alive. She was hidden. The sounds of the hunt had faded, the men led astray by the phantom smoke. She looked across the small space at the silent man who had saved her. Not once, but 3 times now. He had lied for her, jumped with her, and run with her. He had put himself between her and them, a silent, unmovable wall. He had asked for nothing, explained nothing. In the emptiness of the desert, under the threat of death, this stranger had become her entire world. She didn't know his name, where he was from, or where he was going. All she knew was the steady grip of his hand and the undeniable fact that she was only alive because he had willed it so, there, in the cold, silent dark of the ravine, with no path back and an uncertain road ahead. A fragile seed of trust began to take root in the barren ground of her fear. It was a trust born not of words or promises, but of shared flight and a debt that could never be repaid. She was no longer just running from something. She was running with someone. They walked through the night. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky sprayed with an impossible number of stars. The desert, so hostile and glaring by day, transformed into a place of deep shadows and hushed secrets. Silas moved with a certainty that defied the darkness, navigating by the shape of the ridgeline against the stars, his steps quiet and sure on the rocky ground. Ellie followed in his wake, a ghost haunted by the memory of the train. Her ankle was a throbbing knot of fire, but she didn't complain. Complaint was a luxury, and she had nothing left to spend. He had torn a strip from the hem of her already ruined dress and bound her ankle with a practiced efficiency that suggested he had tended to worse injuries, perhaps on himself. He offered her water from his canteen, and when she drank too greedily, he didn't scold her, but simply placed a steadying hand on the canteen, slowing her down. When the sun's first rays cracked the horizon, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and pale lavender, he found them shelter in the overhang of a rock, a shallow cave that offered refuge from the coming heat. He produced a piece of hardtack and a strip of jerky from his pouch, dividing the meager meal with a fairness that was as unspoken as everything else about him. Ellie ate slowly, the dry biscuit scraping her throat. But it was the first food she had tasted since her flight began, and it tasted of survival. She slept in fits and starts, a sleep plagued by the phantom sound of train whistles and men's angry voices. Each time she woke with a gasp, the first thing she saw was Silas, sitting near the mouth of the cave, his back to her, watching the vast, empty landscape as if he were on guard duty. He was a sentinel, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt watched over. Not watched. They walked for another full day. The world was a haze of heat and shimmering air. The silence between them was as vast and unbroken as the land itself. It was no longer a tense, uncertain silence, but something else. It was a shared space, a thing that belonged to both of them. He was a man of few needs and even fewer words, and she was a girl whose words had only ever brought her trouble. The quiet became a language of its own. A pause before a steep climb was a warning. A hand offered to help her over a pile of loose rocks was a conversation. The simple act of him ensuring she walked on the side of him that cast a late afternoon shadow was a verse of scripture. Late in the afternoon of the second day, when Ellie felt her strength was truly gone, that she might simply lie down in the dust and let the desert take her, he stopped. He pointed with his chin. In the distance, nestled in a shallow dip in the land that offered the barest hint of green, was a structure. It was little more than a smudge against the immensity of the landscape, but it was a sign of man, a sign of water, a sign of an end to this endless walking. It was a ranch. As they drew closer, the details emerged, like a photograph slowly coming into focus. It was not a grand place. The main house was built of thick, weathered timber, the wood bleached to a soft silver by years of relentless sun. The roof of the porch sagged in the middle, but looked stubborn, as if it had settled into a comfortable slump and had no intention of falling. A large barn stood nearby, its paint long since peeled away, its doors slightly askew. There was a corral with a single, sturdy-looking horse that raised its head and watched their approach, a stone well with a wooden bucket, and a small, fenced-in vegetable patch that showed signs of a determined battle against the arid soil. The place wasn't thriving. It was surviving. It was a testament to endurance, carved from the land itself. It felt like an extension of the man walking beside her. A figure detached itself from the side of the barn as they approached. It was a boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with a thatch of sandy hair and a face smudged with dirt. He had been splitting firewood, and he held the axe with a familiarity that spoke of daily chores. He watched them come, his eyes, a startlingly bright blue, fixed on Silas, then flicking to Ellie with a guarded curiosity. He wasn't scared, just cautious, a stray dog deciding if a stranger was a threat or a source of a meal. "Silas," the boy said. His voice was clear, unbroken. It was a simple statement of fact, not a question. "Tom," Silas replied, his voice holding the slightest hint of warmth, a subtle shift in tone that Ellie had not heard before. He gave a slight nod toward Ellie. She'll be staying a while." He didn't offer her name because he didn't know it. The thought struck Ellie with a strange pang. She had shared the most desperate moments of her life with this man, and he didn't even know her name. "Ellie," she said, her voice a little more than a croak. "My name is Ellie." The boy, Tom, gave a curt nod, accepting this information as he accepted everything else, without fuss. He seemed to have learned his economy of speech from the same teacher as Silas. "I'll fetch some water for the horse," Tom said, and turning, he dropped the axe and headed for the well, his movements efficient and practiced. Silas led her to the porch of the main house. The boards creaked a weary welcome under their feet. The inside was sparse and clean. There was a main room with a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area in the corner. A ladder led up to a sleeping loft. Everything was functional, stripped of any ornament, yet it felt more like a home than the frilly, suffocating room she'd had above Gable's saloon. "The loft is yours," Silas said, gesturing with his head. "Tom sleeps in the barn. I take the floor." He didn't wait for a reply, but went to the kitchen, ladling water from a bucket into a tin basin. He set it on the table. "Wash up. There's stew on the hearth." He turned and left, his footsteps heavy on the porch, heading toward the barn, leaving her alone in the sudden, overwhelming quiet of the house. For a long moment, Ellie just stood there, swaying with exhaustion. The scent of old wood smoke, and something savory from the pot filled her senses. It was the smell of safety. She looked at her reflection in the basin of water. A stranger looked back at her, a wild-eyed, dirty-faced girl with twigs in her tangled hair and a long scratch on her cheek. She plunged her hands into the cool water and began to wash, scrubbing away the grime of the train, the dust of the desert, the lingering touch of her fear. The next morning, she woke to the soft, golden light filtering through a small window in the loft. For a single, disoriented second, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back, not with the usual wave of panic, but with a strange, new stillness. She was in Silas's house. She was safe. Below, the main room was empty. His bedroll was gone from the floor. Outside, she could hear the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. She found a simple dress, worn but clean, folded at the foot of her cot. It was too big for her, but it was a kindness so profound it made her throat ache, dressed in the borrowed clothes. She crept out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and clean. Silas was by the woodpile, his back to her, the muscles in his shoulders and back moving with a powerful grace as he swung the axe. Tom was coming from the corral, carrying a bucket of milk. They moved in a quiet, practiced rhythm, a silent dance of morning chores. No one told her what to do, and for the first time in her life, no one was ordering her around. She saw a straw broom leaning against the wall of the house. On impulse, she picked it up. The handle was smooth from use. She started at one end of the porch, her movements stiff and awkward at first, then settling into a steady, sweeping motion. The soft scratch of the bristles on the wood was a satisfying sound. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was helping. She was earning her keep in the only way she knew how. Silas paused his chopping, his axe resting on the block, and watched her for a moment. He didn't smile, but he gave a single, slow nod before turning back to his work. The nod was a word of thanks, a sign of acceptance. It was enough. Her days fell into a new rhythm, governed by the sun and the simple, pressing needs of survival. She learned to collect the warm, brown eggs from the squawking hens in the small coop behind the barn, her hands gentle so as not to startle them. She learned to draw water from the deep, cool well, the rope biting into her soft hands. She spent hours in the vegetable patch, pulling weeds and tending to the stubborn squash and bean plants under Tom's silent tutelage. The boy rarely spoke, but he would show her, with a simple gesture, which plant was a weed and which was a vegetable, which bean was ripe for picking and which needed another day of sun. In these small, repetitive tasks, she found a strange sort of peace. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede, replaced by the simple ache of tired muscles and the satisfaction of a task completed. Her world, which had been a terrifyingly large and hostile place, shrank to the boundaries of this small, struggling ranch. And in this small world, she began to breathe again. Silas was a constant presence, yet he was rarely close. He was a figure in the middle distance, mending a section of fence at the edge of the property, repairing a harness in the shade of the barn, or simply sitting on the porch steps in the evening, sharpening a knife. His movements economical and precise, his silence, which had at first been an intimidating void, became a comforting backdrop to her new life. It was a silence that did not demand or question. It was a silence that allowed her to simply be. It was a wall that kept the dangers of the outside world at bay. And inside that wall, she was safe. His quiet was not a barrier between them. It was the shelter he had built around her. A week bled into two, and the rhythm of the ranch became the rhythm of Ellie's life. The initial, sharp-edged fear began to dull. The constant looking over her shoulder replaced by the forward-looking task of pulling a stubborn weed or fetching water from the well. She learned the particular creak of the third porch step, the way the wind whispered through the eaves of the barn just before dawn, and the exact shade of blue the distant mountains turned just before the sun set. These small, solid truths began to build a foundation under her, something real to stand on after a lifetime of walking on thin ice. The evenings were the quietest time. After a simple supper of stew or beans with bacon, Tom would take a book he had a small, treasured stack of 3 and climb to his sleeping spot in the hayloft of the barn. Silas would often sit on the porch, staring out into the vast, star-dusted darkness, a silent communion with the night. Ellie would stay inside, cleaning up from the meal, the simple, repetitive motions a balm to her restless mind. On one such evening, the air was still and cool. A cricket chirped a lonely song from somewhere under the house. Ellie was at the basin, washing the 3 tin plates and the heavy iron pot. The water was warm from the kettle, and the soap she made from lye and leftover fat smelled clean and harsh. She was scrubbing at a stubborn spot on the pot when her wet fingers slipped. The plate clattered against the inside of the basin with a sharp crack, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was an old, ingrained reaction. At Gable's saloon, a dropped plate meant a sharp word, a docked wage, or worse. His heavy hand on her arm, his fingers digging in as he reminded her of her place. She waited, her shoulders tensed, for the inevitable anger, but it didn't come. From the doorway leading to the porch, Silas simply looked at her. He had been on his way out, but had paused at the sound. His face, half in shadow, was unreadable as always, but there was no anger in his posture, no tightening of his jaw. He just watched her, his gray eyes steady. He took a step back inside, letting the screen door close softly behind him. He walked over to the table, picked up a clean, dry rag that was hanging from a nail, and came to stand beside her at the basin. He said nothing. He simply took the wet plate she had just washed from the small wooden rack and began to dry it, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the tin. His nearness was overwhelming. He was a wall of solid warmth beside her. The simple, domestic act this shared, mundane chore was so unexpected, so profoundly normal, that it broke something loose inside her. It was a kindness she didn't know how to process. All the words she had kept locked away, all the fear she had swallowed down, all the history that defined her, suddenly rose up, a bitter flood in her chest. My father died of a fever when I was 12. She said, the words came out in a whisper, addressed to the soapy water, to the plate in her hands, to anyone but the man standing beside her. My mother. She followed him a year later. They said it was a broken heart, but I think it was just that the world was too hard for her on her own. Silas continued to dry the plate, his motions slow and deliberate. He gave no sign that he had heard, but she knew he was listening. His stillness was a form of attention, more focused than any nod or encouraging word could ever be. We had a small farm. It wasn't much. After she was gone, the banker came. He took the farm, the mule, everything. He said I still owed. He called it an indenture. She scrubbed at the plate in her hands, her knuckles white. He sold my paper to Mr. Gable. He owned the saloon in town. The banker said I was lucky. Said Mr. Gable needed a girl to clean, to serve drinks. He said it was honest work. She paused, taking a shaky breath. Silas placed the first dry plate on the table with a soft clink and took the next wet one from the rack. The simple rhythm of their task, wash, rack, dry, stack, became the current that carried her story forward. It wasn't honest work. It was ownership. Mr. Gable. He looked at me like I was a horse he'd bought, something to be used until it was used up. I slept in a small room upstairs. The lock was on the outside of the door. Every night, I would listen to the noise from downstairs, the shouting, the piano, the breaking glass, and I would pray for morning. And every morning, I would start cleaning up the mess from the night before. He was careful. He knew the law. But his eyes were always on me, and his men, they were the same. They knew I belonged to him. I learned to make myself small. I learned to look at the floor, to not speak unless I was spoken to be invisible. But you can't be invisible when you're the only girl in a room full of thirsty, lonely men. She felt the hot shame of it all, the humiliation she had lived with every single day. She had never spoken these words aloud to anyone. To say them now, in this quiet, safe kitchen, felt like lancing a wound. A few weeks ago, a man came through. A trapper with a lot of money from his season's haul. He spent all of it at Gable's tables, drinking and gambling. He lost everything. I heard them talking through the thin wall of the storeroom. Gable and the trapper. The trapper was desperate. Gable, he laughed. He said he would forgive the debt and give him a stake for the next season. For a price. She stopped washing, her hands submerged in the now cool water. Her whole body was trembling. Silas stopped drying. He stood perfectly still beside her, the wet plate in one hand, the dry rag in the other, waiting. I was the price, she whispered. The words were heavy, ugly things in the clean air of the kitchen. He was selling my indenture, sending me with the trapper, up into the mountains. Gable said a man gets lonely up there. He said the trapper would take good care of me. Her voice cracked on the last words. The memory of Gable's greasy, knowing smile making her feel sick. I knew I couldn't go. It was one thing to be in the town, where there were other people, where I could at least pretend there was a law, but to be alone with that man, in the wilderness, it was a death sentence. Maybe not a quick one, but a death all the same. So that night, I waited until I heard Gable snoring in his room. I put on my dress, took the only $2 I had ever managed to save, and I climbed out my window. I ran until my lungs were on fire. I hid in a livery until I saw the train getting ready to leave at dawn, and I slipped aboard. She finally looked up from the basin, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, and met his gaze. He had turned his head slightly, and, in the soft lamplight, his gray eyes were dark and deep. They held no pity. Pity was a useless, condescending emotion, and she had seen enough of it from church ladies who did nothing to help. His eyes held something else, something harder and more solid. It was understanding. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the world's ugliness, a shared recognition that survival was a brutal business. "I thought I had gotten away," she continued, her voice gaining a bit of strength from his steady gaze. "But then I saw them at the adobe walls stop. Thorne and Jed and the other one. Gable's men. He must have sent them as soon as he realized I was gone. They were walking through the cars, looking for me. That's when I ran to the back. That's when I saw you." The story was told. The last word hung in the air, and the secret was out. No longer her burden to carry alone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of her confession and the quiet strength of his presence. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He didn't say, "I'm sorry that happened to you," or "You were right to run." He didn't make any promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he simply turned back to his task. He took the plate she had been holding, her fingers having gone slack, and placed it on the rack. Then he took another, and began to dry them with the same methodical, unhurried pace as before. She turned back to the basin and continued to wash. They worked in silence. The only sounds, the soft splash of water and the gentle clink of tin. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a space between two strangers. It was a bridge. His simple, continued presence at her side was his answer. His willingness to stand there, sharing this simple task, was his vow. It said, "I heard you. I am still here. You are not cleaning up this mess alone." A language was being built between them, not of words and sounds, but of shared space and quiet actions. It was a language of survival, of mutual respect. He had offered his protection without knowing why she needed it. Now that he knew, his protection had not wavered. If anything, it had solidified, settling around her as surely as the stone walls of the house. When the last pot was washed and dried and put away, she turned to thank him, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. He was already at the door, his hand on the latch. He paused and looked back at her, his face silhouetted against the deep indigo of the night sky. "The bolt is on the inside," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Use it." Then he was gone, his footsteps creaking once on the porch before fading into the night. Ellie stood alone in the lamplit kitchen. She looked at the heavy wooden bolt on the inside of the door, a piece of hardware she hadn't even noticed before. It was thick and solid. For the first time since she was 12 years old, she was in a room with a lock that she controlled. She walked over and slid the heavy bolt home. The sound of it seating into its bracket was the sound of a cage opening, the sound of a breath finally being released. She was no longer just a girl who was hiding. She was a woman in a house where she was safe, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the silent man sleeping on the floor would make sure it stayed that way. The confession, once spoken, did not shatter the quiet of the ranch. Instead, it settled into the foundations of the place, becoming a part of its history, a truth acknowledged and then respectfully absorbed into the silence. The days that followed were different, not in their rhythm or their routine, but in the quality of the air that moved between Ellie and Silas. The space of her past, once a dark and unknown chasm separating them, was now a known territory. He had stood at its edge, looked into its depths, and had not retreated. This knowledge changed everything. Ellie found she could breathe more deeply, that the tension that had lived for years as a tight knot between her shoulder blades began, finally, to unspool. She continued her work, her hands growing calloused and capable. She learned the subtle signs of the desert life around them, the way a hawk's circling shadow meant a rabbit was hiding nearby, the sweet, earthy smell that preceded a rare summer rain, the resilient nature of the small, tough flowers that dared to bloom in the cracks of sun-baked earth. She felt as though she, too, was one of those flowers, a transplant to this harsh soil, slowly, tentatively, beginning to grow. The first sign of the change in him was so small she almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind. One morning, as she unbolted the door to step out onto the porch, she saw it, placed carefully on the weathered railing. Right beside the post she always leaned on while pulling on her work boots was a single, perfect desert marigold. It was a burst of defiant yellow against the silvered wood, its petals still holding the cool dew of the pre-dawn air. It was not a grand bouquet, not a romantic rose, but a simple, wild thing, a survivor. Ellie stopped, her hand frozen on the doorframe. She looked around the empty yard. Tom was already in the corral, forking hay for the horse. Silas was nowhere to be seen, though the neat stack of freshly split firewood beside the chopping block told her he had been up for hours. The flower could not have landed there by chance. It had been placed deliberately. Her first thought was Tom, a boyish prank or a simple gift. But it didn't feel like a gesture a boy like Tom would make. His kindness was practical, direct, like his mentors. This was something else. This was quiet. She picked up the small bloom, its stem fragile between her fingers. A wild, impossible thought flickered in her mind. A thought so audacious she quickly tried to extinguish it, but it lingered, warm and persistent. She took the flower inside, and later that day, when no one was looking, she pressed it carefully between the pages of one of Tom's books, a secret sunbeam captured on paper. A few days later came the second sign. The afternoons were the hottest part of the day, a time when the sun beat down with a physical weight. Ellie had taken to spending an hour after the midday meal in the sliver of shade cast by the north side of the barn, where a large, flat-topped boulder offered a place to sit. She would take her mending there a torn shirt of Tom's, a seam coming loose on one of Silas's denim trousers, and work while the worst of the heat passed. It was her quiet time, a small ritual of her own making. On this day, as she rounded the corner of the barn, her sewing basket in hand, she stopped short. Her spot had been prepared, a piece of thick, soft leather, worn smooth with age and smelling faintly of saddle soap, was folded neatly on the rock, a cushion against its hard surface. Beside it sat a tin cup filled to the brim with water, so fresh from the well that condensation beaded on its sides. A single, broad leaf had been placed over the top to keep the dust and insects out. She stood motionless, her heart giving a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. This was no accident. This was an act of profound observation. He had noticed her habit. He had seen where she sat, had recognized that the rock was hard, that the afternoon was hot. He had anticipated her needs and met them before she had even felt them herself. It was not a romantic gesture in the way a poet might understand, but it was deeply, incredibly tender. It was a conversation without a single word. "I see you," it said. "I see your small comforts, and they are important to me." She sat down on the leather cushion, the coolness of the water a balm to her dry throat. She looked out across the yard, to where Silas was methodically sharpening the blade of a scythe, his movements focused and efficient. He didn't look up, but she felt his awareness of her, a silent thread connecting them across the sun-drenched space. She was no longer just a stray he had taken in, a responsibility he had shouldered. She was a person whose comfort he considered, a presence he was actively, quietly, making a place for. These small acts began to accumulate, forming a pattern, a new language she was becoming fluent in. One evening, as a cool wind swept down from the mountains, she found the heavy wool blanket from his own bedroll left on the porch swing where she liked to sit and watch the stars appear. Another day. She struggled with a loose handle on the water pump, her hands too small to get a proper grip. The next morning, she found it wrapped tightly with a fresh strip of leather, the grip now secure and perfect for her hands. He never mentioned these things. They simply appeared. Silent solutions to unspoken problems, quiet answers to questions she had never dared to ask. The most undeniable shift came during a meal. Their suppers were quiet affairs, the three of them eating with the focused appetite of people who had earned their food through a long day's labor. Silas always served, ladling the thick stew or scooping the beans from the pot. He always served himself first, then Tom, then her. It was the natural order of things, the man of the house taking his portion first. But one night, he stood over the pot, the ladle in his hand. The rich smell of rabbit stew filled the small room. He filled the first bowl, steam rising in a fragrant cloud. And then, instead of placing it at his own spot at the head of the table, he walked around and set it down in front of her. Ellie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. He met her gaze for only a fraction of a second, his own expression as impassive as ever, before he turned to serve Tom, and then finally, himself. It was a simple, profound reordering of their world, a public declaration made in the quietest possible way. Tom, for his part, glanced from the bowl placed before Ellie to Silas's face, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of the boy's mouth before he quickly looked down at his own plate. He understood. Her skin flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace, her heart hammered against her ribs. In her old life, she had always been served last, if she was served at all, often just taking whatever scraps were left. To be served first was an honor, a gesture of respect, of priority. It elevated her from a guest, from a refugee, to something more, something essential. She began to watch him more closely, not with the fearful observation of a mouse watching a hawk, but with the keen, tender focus of a woman noticing the man she was coming to care for. She noticed the way the sun had etched fine lines around his gray eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck when it grew long. She saw the deep weariness that sometimes settled in his shoulders after a day of back-breaking work, a weariness he never spoke of. She noticed the rare, unguarded moments when he would watch Tom practicing his reading, a look of quiet, fierce pride softening the hard lines of his face. She realized that his silence was not an absence of feeling, but a different kind of presence. His feelings were not in his words, but in his hands. They were in the solid, repaired fence that kept them safe, in the firewood he chopped to keep them warm, in the clean water he drew for her to drink. And now, they were in the desert flower, the leather cushion, the first bowl of stew. Each action was a syllable, a word, a sentence in his silent confession of affection. He was not a man of poetry, but he lived a life of practical, profound verses. She started to answer in his language. When she saw his gloves were frayed, she spent an evening meticulously restitching the seams with strong thread. When his canteen was empty, she would fill it with fresh, cool water before he thought to ask. She would save him the last piece of cornbread, placing it beside his plate. These were her own quiet replies, her own small actions and unspoken promises. It was a courtship conducted in the spaces between words, a love story written in the language of thoughtful deeds, and in the vast, lonely expanse of the desert, under the watchful eyes of the silent mountains. It was more than enough. The peace of the ranch was a fragile thing, a glass vessel held in the vast, calloused hand of the desert. For weeks, that vessel had held the quiet moments, the unspoken kindnesses, the steady rhythm of their new life. And then, in the bruised twilight of a late summer evening, it was shattered. It began with the dust, a low, angry cloud on the horizon, catching the last bloody rays of the setting sun. Ellie saw it first. She was on the porch, shaking a tablecloth free of crumbs, her movements slow and content. Tom was in the corral, giving the horse a final measure of oats. his small silhouette moving with a familiar, comforting purpose. Silas was in the barn, the rhythmic scrape of a whetstone on steel echoing softly in the cooling air. The world was as it should be. But the dust cloud was wrong. It was too fast for a lone rider, too purposeful for a stray herd. A cold knot of dread, a feeling she had almost forgotten, tightened in her stomach. She stood frozen, the tablecloth clutched in her hand, as the cloud resolved itself into 3 distinct figures on horseback, riding hard and low. They weren't neighbors. They weren't lost travelers. They rode with the relentless, predatory focus of wolves that have finally caught the scent of their quarry. Her mind refused to accept it, but her body knew. This was the end of the quiet. This was the past, riding furiously to reclaim her. "Silas!" Her voice was a thin, strangled thing, swallowed by the sudden immensity of the threat. From the corral, Tom looked up, his face a pale question mark in the gloom. From the barn, the scraping sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, profound, a held breath before a scream. The riders didn't slow. They thundered into the yard, their horses churning the dust, their face grim masks of violent intent under the low brims of their hats. Ellie's blood ran cold as she recognized them. The sharp, cruel face of Thorn, the brutish, heavy-shouldered form of Jed. The third man was a stranger, but he had the same hard, empty eyes as the others. "Well, well," Thorn's voice cut through the air, thin and sharp as a shard of glass. He reined his horse in, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with a proprietary sneer. "Looks like the rabbit found herself a burrow." He looked directly at Ellie, and his smile was a slash of triumph. "Gable sends his regards. He wants his property back." The world seemed to shrink and slow down. Ellie was paralyzed, her feet rooted to the porch boards. This was the nightmare she had outrun, the memory that haunted her sleep, now made real and solid in her front yard. Silas emerged from the shadowed maw of the barn. He moved without haste, his long duster coat settling around him. He held the newly sharpened scythe in one hand, its curved blade gleaming like a sliver of the moon. His face was a mask of cold fury, his gray eyes narrowed to slits of stone. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice a low growl that was more dangerous than any shout. "Turn your horses and ride out." Jed laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. "And who's gonna make us, you farmer?" He swung down from his horse, his hand already on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. The third man dismounted as well, moving to flank him. "Tom, get in the house," Silas commanded, his voice sharp, never taking his eyes off the men. But Jed was already moving, his target clear. He wasn't interested in Silas. He was lunging for the corral, for the boy. "We'll take the boy, too, a little insurance." That one sentence broke the spell of Ellie's fear. The terror for herself was a cold, paralyzing thing. But the threat to Tom, to this quiet, serious boy who had shown her where the best beans grew, who had shared his precious books with her, that was a fire. Everything happened at once. As Jed scrambled over the corral fence, Silas moved. He didn't charge. He threw the scythe. It spun end over end, a cartwheel of polished steel and death. Not at the men, but at the ground in front of their horses. The heavy blade bit deep into the earth, and the horses screamed, rearing back in panic, their eyes rolling. The third man was thrown as his horse shied violently away. The diversion gave Silas the second he needed. He drew the revolver from the holster hidden beneath his duster with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion that belied his calm demeanor. The gun bucked in his hand, its roar deafening in the twilight. Thorn, still on his spooked horse, cursed and fired back. A bullet splintered the porch railing next to Ellie's head, showering her with sharp slivers of wood. The sound jerked her back to life. She scrambled backward, falling through the doorway into the relative darkness of the house. "Tom!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. She saw the boy, who had been frozen with fear. Finally, bolt! He scurried under the fence rails on the far side of the corral, making a desperate run for the back of the house. But Jed was over the fence now, his heavy boots pounding the dirt, cutting off Tom's path. Outside, the world was a cacophony of chaos. Gunshots boomed, horses screamed, men shouted curses. Ellie crawled to the small front window, peering out. Silas was using the corner of the barn as cover, firing with a cold, methodical precision. Thorne was firing from his saddle, trying to control his panicked horse. The third man was on the ground, clutching his arm, his gun lost in the dust. But Jed was ignoring the fight. He had Tom. He had cornered the boy against the stone wall of the well. Tom was small and terrified, looking for a way to escape, but there was nowhere to go.
"Gotcha, little rat!"
Jed snarled, reaching for him. A primal rage, fierce and pure, erupted in Ellie's chest. It was a feeling she had never known, an inferno that burned away every last shred of her fear, her submissiveness, her lifelong instinct to be invisible. She would not let this happen. She would not let them destroy this place, this boy, this fragile piece. Her eyes fell on the rifle. It rested on two wooden pegs above the stone fireplace. A long, heavy Kentucky rifle. It was Silas's. She had seen him clean it, his movements reverent and sure. To her, it had always been a thing of death, a symbol of the violence of this land. Now, it was the only thing that made sense. Her hands shook so badly she could barely lift it from the pegs. It was heavier than she could have imagined, cold and alien in her grasp. She had never fired a gun in her life. She didn't know how, but she had seen Silas load it. Powder, patch, ball. Her fingers were clumsy, fumbling with the powder horn and the small leather pouch that hung beside it. Powder spilled on the floor. Her hands, slick with sweat, could barely seat the lead ball. It felt like an eternity. The sounds of the battle outside a roaring in her ears. Finally, she pulled the heavy hammer back. The double click was the loudest sound in the world. She pushed the long barrel through the broken window pane, the jagged glass scraping the wood. She rested it on the sill, trying to steady her breathing, trying to steady her hands. Through the sights, the world was a narrow, terrifying tunnel. She saw Jed, his broad back to her, his hand reaching out, his fingers just inches from Tom's shoulder. She saw Tom's face, pale and streaked with tears, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored every nightmare she had ever had. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a mule kick to her shoulder that threw her back onto the floor. The house filled with the acrid smell of burnt powder. Her ears rang, and her shoulders screamed in agony. For a moment, she thought she had failed. But when she scrambled back to the window, the scene had changed. Jed was staggering away from the well, clutching his thigh, a dark stain spreading across his trousers. He was screaming, a high, thin sound of shock and pain. Her shot had been wild, low and to the left, but it had found a mark. It had been enough. Tom, seeing his chance, darted away, scrambling around the side of the house and disappearing into the darkness. He was safe. A wave of dizzying relief washed over her, so powerful it almost made her sick. But it lasted only a second. Her shot, the shot that had saved Tom, had also revealed her position. Thorne, his face a mask of incandescent rage, wheeled his horse around and fired 2 quick shots into the house. Bullets tore through the thin walls, one thudding into the log just above her head. The shots also created a fatal diversion. Silas, hearing the shots fired at the house, at Ellie, made a single, critical mistake. For a fraction of a second, his attention shifted. He glanced toward the house, his face etched with a new, raw fear. It was the opening the third man had been waiting for. He had retrieved his gun and, ignored in the chaos, had crept along the side of the barn. Now! He rose from the shadows, his face contorted in a grimace of pain and hate. He was no more than 10 feet from Silas. "Silas, behind you!" Ellie screamed, but her voice was lost in the ringing of her own ears. Silas heard something. He started to turn. He was too late. The man fired. The bullet caught Silas high in the side, spinning him around. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, but he stayed on his feet, his own gun coming up to fire back. He shot the man in the chest, and the man fell backward without a sound. But Silas was exposed. As he staggered from the impact, Thorne spurred his horse forward, closing the distance. Silas tried to raise his revolver again, but his movements were sluggish. His strength was failing. Jed, howling in pain and fury, had drawn his own gun and was firing wildly from the ground. One of Jed's wild shots struck the heavy wooden beam of the barn just above Silas's head. It didn't hit him, but a large, heavy splinter, a foot long and thick as a man's wrist, was dislodged by the impact. It fell, end over end, striking Silas with sickening force on the side of the head. He made no sound. His legs simply buckled. He collapsed, falling bonelessly into the dust, his gun slipping from his grasp. A dark, wet patch began to spread on the ground beneath his head, black in the dying light. The world stopped. The gunshots, the shouting, the ringing in her ears, it all faded away, replaced by a deafening, roaring silence. All Ellie could see was Silas, lying so terribly still on the ground. The rock, the anchor, the silent mountain of a man who had been her protector, was down.
We got him,
Thorne yelled, a note of savage glee in his voice.
He's down, Jed. Grab the girl.
But Jed was in no shape to grab anyone, and Thorne's horse, spooked by the final exchange of gunfire, was fighting him again, seeing his two men down, one dead and the other wounded. Thorne spat a curse into the dirt.
This ain't over,
he snarled at the silent house. He wheeled his horse around, grabbed the reins of the dead man's mount, and galloped out of the yard, dragging the riderless horse behind him. Jed, moaning and clutching his leg, dragged himself after them, a pathetic, limping figure disappearing into the darkness. They were gone. The attack was over. For a moment, Ellie could only stare at the empty yard, at the still form lying in the dust. Then, a sound tore itself from her throat, a sound she didn't know she was capable of making. It was a scream of pure, undiluted agony and terror, a desperate cry that ripped through the sudden, terrible silence of the ranch. It was the sound of her world breaking apart. It was his name.
Silas!
The echo of her own scream was still hanging in the purple air as she stumbled down the porch steps. The world had narrowed to a single point of focus, the dark, still shape of Silas lying in the dust. The acrid smell of gunpowder was a bitter perfume in the air, a stark reminder of the violence that had just ripped their quiet world apart. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over him, terrified to touch, terrified not to. His face was turned to the side, pale and slack in the twilight. A river of dark blood matted his hair and soaked the dirt beneath his head. The sight of it, so vital and so wrongly spilled, stole the air from her lungs. "Silas," she whispered, the name a prayer, a plea. "Oh God, Silas!" A small sound made her look up. Tom was creeping out from behind the house, his face a ghostly white mask of terror. His eyes were huge and fixed on Silas, his small body trembling. Behind him, in the yard, lay the still, twisted form of the third man, a stark and silent testament to the fight. The sight of the boy's fear was a bucket of ice water, shocking Ellie out of her own paralysis. She could not fall apart. Not now. Tom needed her. Silas needed her. "Tom," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, a stranger's voice taking command. "I need your help. We have to get him inside." The boy just stared, his mind clearly unable to process the horror. "Tom, listen to me," she insisted, her tone sharper, cutting through his shock. "Look at me. We have to move him, now. You have to help me." He flinched, but then his gaze shifted from Silas to her face. and he seemed to find a fragile anchor in her desperate resolve. He gave a jerky, silent nod. Getting him into the house was a nightmare of dead weight and desperate strength. Silas was a big man, a solid mass of muscle and bone. Ellie was wiry, and Tom was just a boy. They took his arms, trying to drag him. It was impossible. He was too heavy, an anchor pinning them to the scene of the violence.
The blanket,
Ellie gasped, an idea sparking.
from the porch swing. Get it!
Tom ran, his small legs pumping, and returned with the thick wool blanket Silas had left for her. Together, they managed to roll him, grunting with the effort, onto one edge of it. His body was limp, his head lolling with a sickening looseness that sent a fresh wave of terror through Ellie. They grabbed the corners of the blanket and pulled. It was a slow, agonizing journey across the yard and up the 2 steps of the porch, their muscles screaming, their breath coming in ragged sobs. They left a dark, terrible trail in the dust. Inside, they dragged him close to the hearth, the only place that held any warmth against the coming night's chill. Ellie gently, carefully, pillowed his head on a folded horse blanket. For the first time, she could see the full extent of his injuries. The gash on his head was deep and ugly, a ragged tear in his scalp from the splinter of wood. It was still oozing blood. The bullet had taken him high in the side, just below his ribs. His shirt was a stiff, dark map of his own blood.
Water, Tom,
she commanded, already tearing strips from the clean dress Silas had given her. And all the clean rags you can find, then build up the fire. We need more light. Tom, his face still pale but his movements no longer hesitant, obeyed without a word. He became her hands and feet, a silent, efficient shadow. He brought a basin of water, a stack of old flour sacks, and he coaxed the embers in the hearth back to a steady, warm glow. Ellie's world shrank to the few feet of floor space around Silas, the dead man in the yard, the threat of Thorne returning, the terrifying uncertainty of their future, all of it faded away. There was only the task at hand. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in her stomach, but it was now a fuel, not a paralyzer. Every action became a prayer. She washed the blood from his face with a tenderness that made her own hands ache. His skin was cold. She cleaned the gash on his head, her touch as light as she could make it, her stomach churning at the sight. She packed it with a clean cloth, praying it would be enough to stop the bleeding. Then she took Silas's own knife, the one she had seen him sharpening so many times, and with a deep, shuddering breath, she cut away the bloody fabric of his shirt. The bullet wound was a dark, angry hole. She didn't know what to do. She had no doctor's skills, only the vague, half-remembered knowledge of a farm girl who had seen her share of animal injuries. She washed it as best she could, her hands shaking. She thought of her mother, who had always used a poultice of yarrow and comfrey for wounds. She sent Tom out into the darkness with a lantern to the small herb patch she had been tending by the well. He came back with a handful of the correct leaves, his face grim with concentration. She crushed them between 2 stones, mixed them with a little hot water, and applied the warm, green paste to the wound before binding his torso tightly with long strips of cloth. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The house was quiet. Silas's breathing was shallow, a faint, ragged sound in the stillness. Tom had fallen asleep, curled up in a chair, his face finally lax in the firelight. The first night of the vigil began. Ellie did not sleep. She sat on the floor beside Silas, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest. Every breath he took was a victory. Every moment he remained with them was a gift. The lamplight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the familiar room into a strange, menacing landscape. She would get up to bathe his face with cool water, to check his bandages, to listen to the whisper of his breath. She was no longer running. She was a guardian, a sentry posted at the edge of life and death. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the world was utterly still, her control finally broke. The enormity of what she stood to lose crashed down on her. This silent, steady man who had saved her, who had given her a home, who had shown her kindness in a language of deeds, not words he was slipping away. A single tear slid down her cheek, hot against her cold skin. Then another. Soon, a silent, desperate flood was pouring from her, a river of all her fear and all her dawning love. She leaned over him, her shoulders shaking, and her tears fell onto his still chest, dark spots on the rough fabric of his undershirt.
Please, Silas,
she whispered, her voice breaking, the words for his ears only.
Please don't go. Don't leave us. I'm not afraid anymore. But I can't do this without you. Please come back.
The days and nights blurred into one long, continuous prayer. Tom took over the outside chores with a solemn maturity far beyond his years. He milked the cow, fed the horse, and dealt with the grim necessity of dragging the dead man far from the house and covering him with a cairn of stones, all without being asked. He would appear at Ellie's side with a cup of broth for her, a piece of bread. His quiet insistence a lifeline she clung to. They were a family, forged in crisis, bound by their shared devotion to the man lying between them. On the third day, the fever came. Silas's skin, once so cold, became a furnace. He began to mutter, his head thrashing from side to side. The words were disjointed, fragments of a life she knew nothing about. He spoke of a river, of a woman named Maria, of a fire. His demons, locked away behind his wall of silence, were now set loose by the fever. Ellie listened, her heart aching for the pain in his voice. She spent hours bathing his burning skin, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, whispering to him, trying to soothe the ghosts that haunted him. She fought the fever with a fierce, stubborn tenacity. She was no longer just a girl who had run from a saloon. She was a warrior, and this fever was her enemy. She would not let it take him. Then, on the morning of the 5th day, the fever broke. She had fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting on her arms on the edge of the cot they had moved him to. She awoke to a change in the quality of the silence. The ragged, fevered breathing was gone. It was replaced by a slow, even rhythm. She lifted her head, her body stiff and aching, and she found him looking at her. His eyes were open. They were no longer dull and clouded with pain, but clear and startlingly gray. They were filled with a deep, soul-wearying exhaustion. But they were his. He was there. He was back. A cry, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief, caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. She could only look at him, her own eyes filling with fresh tears. But these were not tears of sorrow. He looked at her. Then his gaze traveled slowly around the room, taking in the signs of the long vigil, the basins of water, the pile of bloody rags, the rifle now resting in the corner where she'd left it. His eyes came back to her face, and in their depths, she saw a universe of unspoken questions and a dawning, profound understanding. He knew. He knew what she had done, how long she had watched over him. His lips moved, forming a dry, rasping sound. "Shh," she whispered, her voice thick. She reached out and gently touched his hand. His skin was cool. "Don't try to talk, just rest." He held her gaze, a long, silent conversation passing between them. It was a conversation that acknowledged the violence, the fear, the long, dark nights, and the fierce, stubborn hope that had held them all together. No words were needed. Everything was there, in the space between their eyes. She gave him a small, watery smile, the first true smile that had touched her lips in days. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, her voice soft but steady, the words a simple, solid truth that had been forged in the fire of the last week. "Not since I met you." A flicker of something gratitude, relief, something deeper moved in his eyes. His fingers, weak and trembling, closed around hers, The pressure was faint, barely there, but it was an answer. It was a promise. It was everything. He was here. She had stayed. And in the quiet morning light of the battered ranch house, they were both, finally, home. The violence of that night did not simply end when the riders disappeared into the darkness. It left echoes, ghosts that lingered in the splintered wood of the porch and in the unnerving stillness of the yard. But the immediate, desperate fight for Silas's life was replaced by a different kind of battle. A slow, quiet, and determined campaign waged against the encroaching shadows of death and despair. This new fight was measured not in gunshots, but in spoonfuls of broth, in clean bandages, and in the steady, patient passage of time. Silas did not wake with a sudden, miraculous recovery. He drifted in and out of consciousness for days, a ship lost in a fog of pain and fevered dreams. When he was finally lucid, he was profoundly weak, a stranger in his own powerful body. The man who could throw a scythe with deadly accuracy could not at first lift a tin cup to his own lips. The man who had walked for days across the desert could not cross the small room without leaning heavily on Ellie's shoulder. This reversal of roles settled upon the small house with a quiet gravity. Ellie, once the protected, became the protector. Her days were a litany of small, essential tasks. She would change his bandages, her touch gentle but firm, her face a mask of concentration as she examined the healing wounds. The gash on his head slowly closed, leaving a stark, pale scar that cut a path through his dark hair. The bullet wound in his side was a deeper, angrier thing, and it was weeks before she could look at it without the metallic taste of fear rising in her throat. She would cook for him, simple, nourishing broths and thin gruels, and would sit patiently by his side, feeding him one slow spoonful at a time. Tom, in the way of children forced to grow up too fast, became the man of the ranch. He rose before the sun, did the morning milking, fed the horse, and checked the fences with a solemn dedication that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He worked with a silent, focused energy, as if he believed that by keeping the ranch in perfect order, he could somehow will its master back to health. Silas, for his part, endured his confinement with a stoic, simmering frustration. He was not a man built for stillness or for reliance on others. Ellie would see him watching Tom from the window, his jaw tight, his hands clenching the rough blanket, his pride warring with the weakness of his body. He rarely spoke of his pain or his frustration, but Ellie could feel it radiating from him. She learned to read the subtle signs of his discomfort, a slight tensing around his eyes, a new stiffness in his shoulders, and would adjust his pillows or bring him a cup of willow bark tea without a word being exchanged. Their life became a diary written in these quiet, shared actions. One afternoon, while Ellie sat by the window, mending a tear in one of Tom's shirts, the needle flashing in the sunlight, she felt Silas's eyes on her. He had been sleeping, but was now awake, watching her, his expression thoughtful. She finished her seam, knotted the thread, and bit it clean. As she folded the small shirt, Silas gestured with his chin toward his own leather satchel, which was hanging from a peg on the wall. "In the bag," he said, his voice still raspy from disuse. "Needle, all." She brought the satchel to him. He rummaged inside with one hand and produced a curved leather needle, a sharp awl, and a roll of waxed thread. He pointed to the heavy leather harness that was slung over a chair, its main strap frayed and nearly broken. It was a task he would normally have done himself in minutes. Now, he held the tools out to her. It was a transfer of responsibility, an admission of his own current limitations, and an expression of trust. She took them, and as their fingers brushed, a current of understanding passed between them. She spent the rest of the afternoon on the floor by his cot, her head bent in concentration, her small hands struggling with the thick, unforgiving leather while he watched, offering a quiet direction only when she seemed lost. They did not speak of what they were doing. They were simply mending what was broken, together. The first time he tried to stand was a monumental event. He pushed himself up, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his muscles trembling from the effort. He swayed, and for a terrifying moment, Ellie thought he would fall. She was at his side in an instant, her shoulder under his arm, her hand firm on his back.
"I've got you,"
she whispered. He leaned on her, his weight a heavy, solid thing. She could feel the heat of his body, the tremor of his exhausted muscles. He smelled of soap and herbs and the faint, underlying scent of the man himself. For a long moment, they stood there, locked in a strange, intimate dance of weakness and strength. He was the mountain, and she, for now, was the earth holding him up. He took one step, then another, his reliance on her absolute. They were not just a man and a woman. They were two survivors, scarred and battered, learning to walk again in a world they had almost lost. As autumn began to paint the sparse foliage in shades of rust and gold, Silas's strength slowly returned. With it came the task of repairing the ranch. The scars on the buildings were a constant, ugly reminder of the attack. The first project they tackled together was the porch railing, where Thorne's bullet had left a jagged, splintered hole. They worked in the crisp morning air, a comfortable silence between them. Silas, now able to stand and work for short periods, showed her how to measure the new piece of wood, how to saw a clean, straight line. His movements were still slow, deliberate, but the sureness was returning to his hands. He would hold the new rail in place, his muscles straining, while she hammered the nails home. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her hammer was a sound of restoration, a sound of life being rebuilt. Tom would bring them nails or fetch a different tool, a small but vital part of their three-person construction crew. They were not just fixing a porch, they were reclaiming their home, nail by nail. They were smoothing over the violent memories with the grain of new wood, proving to themselves and to the ghosts of that night that they were still there, that they had endured. They did not speak of love. The word was too small, too flimsy to contain the vast, solid thing that was growing between them. Love was in the way he would leave a bucket of fresh water on the porch for her, knowing her hands ached after a morning of laundry. It was in the way she would save the tenderest part of the meat for him, placing it on his plate without comment. It was in the way he would watch her as she read to Tom in the evenings, her voice soft in the firelight, his gaze holding a quiet, wondering tenderness. It was in the way she would find his heavy duster coat placed over her shoulders when she fell asleep in the chair by his side. They were living their love, breathing it in with the dusty air, building it into the very structure of the ranch. It was a love that didn't need declarations because it was declared in every shared task, every quiet glance, every anticipated need. It was a foundation, rebuilt stronger than before, because it was now built not just on survival, but on a shared history of sacrifice and devotion. One evening, after the work was done and the supper dishes were cleared, they sat together on the newly repaired porch. Tom was asleep inside. A harvest moon, huge and golden, was rising over the distant mountains, bathing the landscape in a soft, ethereal light. The silence was complete, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Ellie looked at the scar on Silas's head, a pale line in the moonlight. She thought of her own scars, the ones on the inside that were finally beginning to fade. She thought of the girl who had trembled on the train, a girl who had believed her life was over. She seemed like a stranger from a different lifetime. That girl had been running from a life of servitude. But this woman, the woman sitting here now, had chosen her service. She had chosen to serve this small, broken family, to serve this land, to serve this man. And in that choice, she had found not bondage, but a profound and liberating freedom. Silas turned his head and looked at her, his eyes catching the moonlight. He reached over and, for the first time, took her hand. His hand was large and calloused, engulfing hers completely. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His touch spoke of everything, of the terror they had shared, of the long nights of her vigil, of the quiet days of healing, of the future they were building with their own two hands. It was a promise, a thank you, and a declaration, all in the simple, warm pressure of his palm against hers. They had both been wounded, but here, in the quiet moonlight, surrounded by the home they were rebuilding, they were beginning to heal. The scars remained, but new life, tough and resilient, was finally beginning to grow. The seasons turned, the relentless heat of summer giving way to the crisp, golden melancholy of autumn. The land, once a shimmering enemy, softened. The sunsets were longer, painting the vast sky in bruised purples and deep oranges, and the air carried the clean, sharp scent of distant rain and dry earth. The rhythm of the ranch was no longer a frantic struggle for survival, but a steady, life-affirming heartbeat. The fence was fully mended, its new posts standing straight and proud against the skyline. The porch no longer sagged in defeat, but bore their weight with a solid, dependable strength. The ranch was healing, and so were its people. Silas had regained his full strength, but the experience had changed him. A new watchfulness lingered in his eyes, but it was softer now, directed not at the horizon for threats, but at the small world he had almost lost. He moved with his old, quiet grace, but there was a new deliberation to his actions, as if he were savoring the simple act of being able to mend a harness or lift a bale of hay. The scar on his head was a permanent, silvered mark, a physical reminder of their shared past. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, Ellie would see him raise a hand to it, his fingers tracing the line with a thoughtful, distant expression. Their life together had settled into a comfortable, unspoken partnership. They were a three-person constellation, each moving in their own orbit, yet held together by an invisible, unbreakable gravity. Tom, Ellie, and Silas. They were a family, not of blood, but of circumstance, of shared trauma, and of a quiet, fierce loyalty. They worked together, ate together, and shared the long, peaceful evenings, creating a home in the vast emptiness of the world. This evening was like many others, yet it felt different, charged with a strange, beautiful stillness. A long day of work was behind them. They had spent the afternoon reinforcing the roof of the small chicken coop, preparing it for the coming winter. They had worked side by side, passing the hammer back and forth, their movements synchronized, their thoughts seemingly aligned without the need for words. Now, the sun was a fiery ember, sinking below the edge of the world. They sat on the porch, a ritual they had adopted. Tom was on the top step, meticulously carving a small piece of scrap wood with a knife Silas had given him, his face a mask of intense concentration. Silas was in his usual chair, leaning back, his long legs stretched out, his gaze fixed on the fading light. Ellie sat on the swing, moving it with the gentle push of one foot, the soft creak of the ropes a soothing, rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. Tom blew the shavings from his carving and held it up for inspection. It was a crude but unmistakable carving of a horse. He looked at it, his brow furrowed. Then he looked up, not at Silas, but at Ellie. "I think it needs a brand," he said, his voice serious. "A brand?" Ellie asked, her heart giving a strange little flutter at being the one consulted. "Yeah," he said, pointing with the tip of his knife. "Every horse on a ranch needs a brand, to show who it belongs to." He looked from the horse to Silas, then back to her. "We don't have a brand." "No, I suppose we don't," Ellie said softly. Tom considered this for a moment. "Maybe we could make one with a T and an S and an E." The simple, childish logic of it struck Ellie with the force of a physical blow. A T for Tom, an S for Silas, an E for Ellie. In his mind, they were a single unit, a ranch, a family that needed a symbol to mark what was theirs. He did not see her as a guest, a refugee who might one day leave. He saw her as a permanent part of the landscape, as fixed and essential as the well and the barn. Her throat tightened with an emotion so powerful it was almost painful. She looked at Silas, expecting him to correct the boy, to explain that things were not so simple. But Silas was watching her, his face unreadable in the deepening shadows. But his eyes held a quiet, waiting intensity. He didn't dismiss the boy's words. He was letting them hang in the air, a question directed not at him, but at her. "That's a fine idea, Tom," she finally managed to say, her voice thick. "You finish your horse. It's getting late." Tom, satisfied, returned to his work. But the conversation, as small as it was, had shifted something in the air. It had brought a long, unspoken question to the surface. What was she? Who was she in this place? Later, after Tom had been sent to his bed in the barn, the silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. The moon began its slow, silent climb, casting long, silvered shadows across the yard. The air grew cooler. Ellie pulled the familiar wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. She watched Silas. He hadn't moved, but she could feel his awareness of her, a palpable presence in the quiet. Her mind drifted back, a painful but necessary pilgrimage, to the train. She remembered the girl she had been, a creature made of pure, raw fear. Her world had been a cage, and her only thought had been to escape to a different cage. She hadn't been running toward anything. She had been running from everything. When she had stumbled into that last train car and seen the tall, silent man in the corner, she had not seen a savior. She had seen a hiding place, a shadow, a temporary reprieve from the monsters who were hunting her. His long coat was a cave, a darkness she could crawl into to escape the blinding, terrifying light of her reality. That was all she had wanted, a moment's peace, a chance to disappear. And now, she looked at the man sitting a few feet away from her. The silhouette was the same tall, broad, still, but he was no longer a shadow to her. He was the most solid thing in her world. His silence was no longer a void, but a language she had learned to speak fluently. It was the language of a desert marigold left on a railing, of a leather cushion on a hard rock, of the first bowl of stew. It was the language of a man who had stood between her and death, who had fallen for her, and who had, in his own quiet way, allowed her to bring him back to life. She had come here seeking a temporary shelter and had found a permanent home. She had wanted to disappear and had instead found herself, for the very first time. The work that had once seemed like a means to earn her keep was now simply her life, a life she cherished. The calluses on her hands were not marks of servitude, but badges of belonging. This land, this house, this quiet, wounded boy, they were hers. And this man, he was the center of it all, the anchor that held her world in place. The fear was gone. She had told him that, in the first lucid moments of his recovery, but she had not told him what had replaced it, a feeling so large, so profound. It had no name. It was gratitude. It was loyalty. It was devotion. It was a deep, abiding peace. And it was a fierce, protective love that had grown so slowly and quietly she hadn't recognized it until it was the very air she breathed. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, that she could not go back to the way things were. The unspoken understanding between them was a beautiful, powerful thing, but it was no longer enough. She needed to tether it to the earth. She needed to give it a voice, even if it was only her own. She needed him to know that she was no longer a refugee in his home. She was a woman who was choosing to be there. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was more terrifying than facing Gable's men, more frightening than firing a rifle in the dark. This was laying her own scarred, battered heart bare. She stopped the swing's gentle motion and stood up. She walked the few steps to his chair and stood before him. He looked up, his face tilted into the moonlight, his eyes questioning. She didn't sit. She simply knelt on the rough porch boards beside his chair, so they were on the same level. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her hand on his. His was resting on the arm of the chair, large and still. Her hand was small against his, the skin of her palm rough from work, but it did not tremble. His skin was warm. He did not pull away. He simply allowed her hand to rest there. A silent question answered with a silent permission. She looked at their joined hands, her calluses against his, and found her voice. It was soft, barely a whisper in the vast, listening night. "At first," she began, her gaze still on their hands, "when I saw you on the train, I only wanted to hide in your coat." She took a breath, the memory of that suffocating, life-saving darkness still so vivid. "It was just a place to disappear. I didn't want anything else." She finally lifted her eyes to his. In the silver light, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the hard line of his jaw, the deep, steady patience in his gaze. He was listening with his whole being. "I'm not that girl anymore," she said, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "I'm not hiding, and I'm not running." She paused, gathering all of her courage, all of her newfound certainty, into a single, simple truth. "Now," she whispered, her voice thick with all the emotion she had held back for so long. "I just want to walk beside you. For my whole life." The words were out. They hung in the still, cool air between them, as real and solid as the moon above. It was not a question. It was a statement, a confession, a vow. He did not speak. A man like Silas would never profane such a moment with clumsy, inadequate words. His answer came in the language she now understood so well. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face, and in them, she saw a lifetime of loneliness and pain begin to recede, replaced by a slow, dawning light. Then, his fingers, which had been resting passively beneath hers, moved. They curled up, slowly, deliberately, engulfing her hand in his. His grip was not crushing, but it was firm, absolute, and deeply reassuring. He squeezed her hand once. That was all. But it was everything. It was a promise. It was an acceptance. It was the answer to a question she hadn't even realized she was asking. It was his own silent vow, given in return, in the firm, warm pressure of his hand. She felt the foundation of her future finally settle into place, solid and unshakable. The promise was made. It was enough. His hand holding hers on the moonlit porch was not an end, but a beginning. It was the silent, solemn turning of a page. The story of the chase, of the fight, of the desperate vigil was finished. A new story, quieter and deeper, had begun to write itself upon the land. Winter came, a season of stark, beautiful austerity. It swept down from the mountains, blanketing the world in a profound and cleansing silence. The wind, a mournful singer, keened around the corners of the house. But inside, there was warmth. There was the steady, crackling life of the fire in the hearth, the smell of baking bread and slow simmering stew, and the quiet, constant presence of each other. The isolation that would have once terrified Ellie became a comfort, a fortress. The world outside, with its gables and its thorns, its cruelties and its debts, ceased to exist. Their world was the four walls of the house, the sturdy timbers of the barn, and the snow-covered expanse of their land. During those long, dark months, the true shape of their family took form. Silas, his body fully healed, took it upon himself to teach Tom the things a father would. He taught him how to read the weather in the clouds, how to track a rabbit in the snow, how to mend a split-axe handle so it was stronger than before. He taught him not with long speeches, but with patient demonstration, with a hand on the boy's shoulder guiding his own. Ellie, in turn, taught Tom his letters. They would sit at the table in the evenings, the firelight dancing on their faces, her finger tracing the words in one of his treasured books. His progress was slow but steady. Each newly recognized word a small, hard-won victory that she celebrated with a quiet pride that was fiercely maternal. She taught him how to patch a hole in his trousers, how to knead dough until it was smooth and elastic, how to tell which wild roots were good for soup. They were filling in the empty spaces in the boy's life, and in doing so, they were filling in their own. She and Silas continued to speak their own silent language, a language now so deeply understood it felt more natural than words. Love was the way he rose every morning before dawn to build up the fire, so the house was warm when she and Tom awoke. It was the way she took his heavy, snow-crusted duster and hung it by the hearth to dry, without him ever having to ask. It was the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the room, a look of quiet, profound contentment on his face. It was the way she would find an extra blanket on her cot on the coldest nights, a silent, watchful act of care. They were a man and a woman who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen to build a small, good thing in its midst. When spring finally broke, it felt like a resurrection. The snow receded, the earth softened, and the first green shoots of life pushed their way through the damp soil. The world reawakened, and so did the ranch. There was a frantic energy to the work, a shared desire to build and to grow. They plowed the small field together, Silas guiding the old plow, Ellie and Tom following behind, breaking up the clods of earth. They planted a larger garden, their hands in the dirt, a shared investment in the future, a tangible act of faith. Summer came, hot and full of life. The days were long and filled with the sweat of honest labor. The corn grew tall, the beans climbed their poles, and the squash swelled on the vine. They were not just surviving anymore. They were building a small, fragile prosperity. The ranch, which had been a place of mere shelter, was becoming a place of abundance. And now, it was autumn again. A full year had passed since the night of the attack. It was the time of harvest, the time of reaping what they had so carefully sown. The air was golden, the light soft and forgiving. The day's work was done. The last of the corn had been brought in, its pale silks rustling in the crib. The cellar was stocked with jars of preserved beans and squash. A colorful army standing guard against the coming winter. A feeling of deep, bone-weary satisfaction settled over the land. Silas stood by the corral, watching the horse, his arms resting on the top rail. Ellie came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked over and stood beside him, her shoulder lightly brushing his arm. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sun begin its slow descent. "The wild asters are in bloom," she said softly, her voice carrying easily in the still air. She was looking past the barn to the small meadow that sloped down toward the creek. In the golden late afternoon light, it was a sea of purple and white, a final, defiant burst of color before the frost. Silas looked where she was pointing. He didn't speak, but after a moment, he pushed himself away from the fence. He looked at her, his gray eyes soft in the warm light, and gave a slight nod toward the meadow. It was an invitation. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She fell into step beside him, and they walked away from the house and the barn, away from the constant, pressing demands of the ranch. Tom saw them go, and, after a moment's hesitation, he ran to catch up, his small hand finding its way into Ellie's. They walked into the meadow, the tall grass whispering against their legs. The air was thick with the sweet, dusty scent of the asters and the rich, loamy smell of the earth. Bees hummed, fat and slow. On their last rounds of the season, the world was peaceful, alive, and utterly, completely theirs. Tom, filled with the boundless energy of a boy at the end of a good day, let go of Ellie's hand and ran ahead, chasing a grasshopper, his laughter echoing in the open space. The sound was pure and untroubled, the sound of a childhood being reclaimed, a sound of joy in a place that had known so much violence. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Ellie and Silas stopped in the middle of the sea of flowers. The sun was on the horizon now, and it bathed them in a light that seemed to make everything sacred. Ellie looked down at her hands. The calluses were still there, but they no longer felt like the marks of a servant. They were the marks of a creator, of a woman who had helped build this life with her own 2 hands. She looked up at Silas. He was watching Tom, a rare, soft smile on his lips. He looked peaceful, the hard lines of his face softened by the golden light. He was no longer just the silent, intimidating man from the train. He was her partner, her protector, her friend. He was the man who had shown her that strength was not about being hard, but about being steadfast. He was the man who had taught her that love was not about pretty words, but about 1,000 small, silent acts of devotion. He seemed to feel her gaze and turned to look at her. The world fell away. There was only the quiet meadow, the sound of the boys' laughter, and the universe contained in the space between their eyes. In his gaze, she saw not the reflection of the frightened girl she had been, but the strong, capable woman she had become, and she knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as solid as the earth beneath her feet, that he saw it too. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of grass from her hair. His touch was light, but it sent a tremor of warmth through her entire body. It was a touch that spoke of familiarity, of tenderness, of a deep and abiding rightness. The girl who had boarded a train a lifetime ago had been running. She had been a leaf torn from a tree, tossed about by a cruel and indifferent wind, destined to be crushed into the dust. She had been empty, hollowed out by fear and loneliness. But the woman standing here now, in this field of wildflowers, was not running. She was standing still, and she was home. She was a tree, scarred and weathered by the storms she had endured. But her roots had found purchase in this hard, unforgiving, beautiful land. She was no longer empty. She was full to bursting with a love so profound it felt like a prayer, a quiet, constant song of gratitude in her heart. They stood side by side, not touching, but connected by an invisible thread, their shadows stretching long behind them in the dying light. They were 2 solitary trees that had, against all odds, grown together, their roots intertwined beneath the soil, their branches reaching for the same sky, strong, resilient, unmovable. The last sliver of the sun disappeared, leaving the sky painted in glorious, fading colors. Tom, his energy finally spent, came trotting back and leaned against Silas's leg, his small chest heaving. Silas placed a hand on the boy's head, a gesture of quiet, absolute ownership and love. Ellie looked at the 2 of them, her 2 boys, her family. A feeling of peace so deep and so complete washed over her that it brought tears to her eyes. The ghosts of her past were finally silent. The fear was gone. She was no longer the girl who was hiding, no longer the woman who was fighting. She was simply Ellie, and she was home. They were staying. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story be heard by more people, please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button.